Well, I was thrilled. I had the manuscript, and so it's funny. I came at this career so sideways, and it was such a blessing in some ways because I didn't climb all those rungs of the ladder. Like if I had started out saying I want to be a writer,
Right.
I would have known how hard this is.
Yeah.
And I didn't know.
No.
I didn't know what I didn't know. So I'm like, all right, I'm done. So like now it gets published, or I'll find a publisher, and how hard can that be?
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the voice to have.
Books really saved my life.
Good evening, everyone. It's really a privilege to be here, and I thank you very much to the Toronto Reference Library and Simon & Schuster for inviting us to be part of the evening. Many of you are here tonight because you may know a lot about ALS. In fact, every note played may not know a lot about ALS, and this book might be your very first introduction. Or maybe you remember the Ice Bucket Challenge, which gave a tremendous boost to ALS fundraising and awareness. But there's still so much more to be done. I'm a big fan of Lisa Genova, and what I love about all of her work is how she can create such a compelling story out of a heartbreaking diagnosis. When my colleagues and I read every note played, we were moved by how accurately it depicts the ALS journey. Although one person is diagnosed, the entire family lives the experience in their own way. My team and I have the privilege of working directly with people and families who are living with ALS. While the healthcare system provides for some of their needs, there are many gaps, and that's where our organization comes in. ALS Canada helps people navigate the healthcare system by providing one-on-one support, access to assistive devices and equipment, and support groups. This is in addition to the role that we play nationally, funding the best ALS research in the country. And all of this is possible because of the generosity of our donors. We are very hopeful that every note played will help to raise awareness of ALS and the difficult journey that families face. And we are so grateful to everyone who is involved in bringing this book to the shelves. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Sarah Fulford. Sarah is the editor-in-chief of Toronto Life, the monthly city magazine that publishes award-winning feature writing and expert service journalism. When she took over the publication in January 2008, she was just 33 years old, making her one of the youngest editors of a major magazine in Canada. Sarah has won 2 national magazine awards for her writing and has contributed articles to publications such as the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and the Walrus. She's also the chair of the Toronto Public Library Foundation, and she'll be moderating tonight's conversation with Lisa Genova. So thank you very much. Enjoy the remainder of the evening. I'll be here to the side and happy to chat with any of you, and I'll hand it over to Sarah.
Thanks so much, Lisa. It is true, I'm chair of the Toronto Public Library Foundation. I'm a huge fan of the library, as I'm sure many of you are. Not only does it have 100 amazing branches, not only do 70% of all Torontonians use the library, but it does amazing programming like this evening. I have the great pleasure of introducing Lisa Genova, who is a very inspiring person. Her career, as some of you know, started out in a somewhat straightforward trajectory, although very, very accomplished. She studied memory loss from strokes in college, and then she earned a PhD in neuroscience from Harvard, studying drug addiction and its molecular basis. She did some work at NIH and Mass General, and she was a bit of a superstar as a scientist and academic. But then her life took a very surprising turn. She wrote a book called Still Alice, which was rejected universally by every agent who took a look at it, couldn't get calls back, and there was no interest in this book at all. Then she did what every aspiring novelist, the one thing they're really, really not supposed to do. She self-published it. She sold it literally out of the back of her car. Miraculously, it was shared, passed hand to hand, and it ended up being reviewed by the Boston Globe. Simon & Schuster then decided it was a book worth publishing, and 6 months later, republished it, I guess, and it debuted at number 5 on the New York Times bestseller list, where it then spent 59 weeks. It was, of course, the basis of the famous 2014 movie Still Alice, which earned Julianne Moore a Best Actress Oscar. From that incredible, improbable, amazing success, she built her second remarkable career in a field that I would say is uniquely her own. She publishes novels that feature characters who suffer from neurological disorders, diseases, or injuries, and all of them are bestsellers. She manages to do this while being a beautiful novelist. Her stories inevitably make you cry and think things you've never thought before and take you to interesting places, and they also teach you a whole lot of stuff you didn't know before without being didactic or pedantic. She's based novels around characters who have had Huntington's disease, something I literally never heard of, called left neglect, which can happen to you if you have a traumatic brain injury, autism, and now this beautiful, emotionally walloping novel, Every Note Played, about a concert pianist who develops ALS. She's a really amazing, remarkable person, and I look forward to speaking with her. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage. So my pleasure. I have a lot of questions about Every Note Played, which, as I said, I devoured and wept and read out loud to my friends and family. But first, if you don't mind, taking me back to that pivotal moment in your life when you transitioned from being a scientist, which is already an accomplishment, to being a novelist. Tell us how that all happened.
Okay. So I got divorced. So I was really, prior to the divorce, I was really busy, but it was actually before my daughter was born. My grandmother had Alzheimer's.
Right.
And as the neuroscientist in my family, I tried to learn everything I could about this disease to better understand it so that we could better take care of her. And I learned a lot, but there was something missing. And it was really an answer to the question, what does it feel like to have this? And everything I read was written from the perspective of an outsider. So I was reading, the scientific literature by scientists and the medical literature written by the clinicians and the social workers and the caregivers. But there was the lack of perspective of someone like my grandmother. And I remember thinking, the sort of aha moment was, well, fiction is a place where you can explore what it feels like to walk in someone else's shoes. That fiction is a place to explore empathy. And that's what was really missing for me. I had sympathy, but I couldn't get to empathy. I could feel bad for her. I couldn't feel with her. I had a really hard time. So I had this idea that I wanted to write a novel, but I don't know how to do that. I'm a scientist. That's, worlds apart. And then so life moved along, and I quit my job when my daughter was born. I had intended to take a year off. My marriage started to unravel, and 1 year turned into 3, and then I was divorced and unemployed and heartbroken and kind of terrified because I was 33, and for the very first time in my life, I had no idea what was going to happen next. And so it was, while it was terrifying at first, it became sort of this opportunity for self-inquiry. So it was, well, what do I want to do next? And if I could do anything I wanted, what would I do? I want to try to write the novel. So that's how that happened.
That's an amazing story. I'm so interested in why the novel, of all the ways to express empathy or to be creative. Were you a big reader? Did you have novels that inspired you? How did that happen?
Well, I've always loved fiction. I don't know if I was a big reader. I always appreciated and loved aspects of pretty much all the books I'd read, but I was a science geek. I was really, into reading about neuroscience and the brain and how the brain works. So I loved Oliver Sacks for that reason. He was a nice bridge between, just the pure science and neurology and the sort of humanizing the diseases. Yeah. So it isn't just the study of a neurological condition. It's the study of a person living with something, and what does that teach us about life? So how did I get to, it's one of those, it really was kind of like have you ever had those aha light bulb moments where it's not necessarily logical or rational, or you couldn't really like, well, it was just an aha, like empathy. Oh, fiction, that's where that happens. Like you can read a story about someone whose situation is so different than yours, but the common threads of humanity get to you and you see yourself in the other. And so, yeah.
So when you were in this pivotal moment in your life and you had finally this manuscript, then what happened?
Well, I was thrilled. I had the manuscript. And so, it's funny. I came at this career so sideways, and it was such a blessing in some ways because I didn't climb all those rungs of the ladder. Like if I had started out saying I want to be a writer, I would have known how hard this is.
Yeah.
And I didn't know. No. I didn't know what I didn't know. So I'm like, all right, I'm done. So like now it gets published, or I'll find a publisher, and how hard can that be? And so I didn't know how discouraging and demoralizing it could be. And so, everyone rejected it. It's funny, I framed the divorce as failure, and that took a long time to sort of move past. I didn't take the rejections as failure. I framed it more as like, well, I thought this was the way the book would get published. There must be another way. And most of them rejected the query letter. So maybe I just wrote a really crappy query letter. But I think it was the responses. So the rejection wasn't to the book itself, so I didn't find that too discouraging. It's like, well, they didn't read it, so they don't necessarily know. And I think that there was this sense, this was back in 2006, and Alzheimer's is really scary. And the fear among the literary agents that I heard back from was, I don't know that people are going to want to read this. This is a topic people aren't like, this is not a romantic comedy you've written about. So there was some fear that there wasn't a market for reading a story about Alzheimer's.
After it was published and it became this massive success, how did that change you?
Well, it changed my career, and that it allowed me to then write more books because now I could actually earn a living doing this. One of the very wonderful things that has come of all of this is that, so this started as a personal quest. I want to understand what it feels like to have Alzheimer's because of this lost connection with my grandmother. And what has happened is that I've recognized that these books can change the world's perception of a disease and the people who live with it. So how it's changed me is that I feel an enormous responsibility and an opportunity to help educate the world about what it feels like to live with these different diseases. So I enjoy being an advocate for these vulnerable folks who have suddenly found themselves, in a living sort of excluded from the community they used to be part of because of some neurological issue. Yes. And I like to think that I'm part of bringing them back into community or having everybody else embrace them again. So that's, in addition to writing the books, I feel like I'm sort of a global ambassador for empathy.
Is it tricky to wear both hats, or does it fit? Because it is such a unique enterprise you're doing. You are writing novels, like hundreds of people have written novels, but you're also, as you say, how you have this other project, which is to bridge two worlds or bring out the humanity in a person with a condition who's not necessarily seen by the world as human. Like, how does it feel to wear those two hats?
Yeah, I don't see them as two different hats, and I understand what you're saying, though. So I think for any novelist, like every character is the hero of his or her own life, and so every person wants to be seen and heard. Yes. And so whatever that and we're only interested in change. Like, how is a person changed by what happens? So it just so happens that in my stories, what happens is a neurological crisis. Right. And so then it's the human story. It's like, what are we wrestling with? It's identity. Who am I? How do I matter? It's about unconditional love. It's about redemption and forgiveness. It's all of these sort of universal human struggles that we can all relate to.
Many of the characters in your book are robbed of something that defines them. So very much identified with the busy mom with the big career in Left Neglected,
Yeah.
who finds herself unable to perform many of the tasks that she considers core to her identity. It's how she's seen by the world, it's how she's understood, it's how she understands herself. What interests you about robbing a character of that part of them that makes them, that so forms their identity?
Yeah, well, two things. This is what actually happens to people who are suddenly confronted with these neurological issues. So with Sarah
Right.
Nickerson in Left
Yes.
Neglected, she's driving down the highway and she's not paying attention to the road. This book is very much about what we pay attention to and don't pay
Yes.
attention to. She's checking her phone. She gets in a car accident. She ends up with a traumatic brain injury and a condition called left side neglect. And so I think that, you know, in all of the books, it's about the stories are a chance for us. So in real life, I interview all these people who have these conditions, and I'm trying to find the truth under the imagined circumstances. And the truth is that they can't be who they were before in some sense. It's like, well, I was doing all of these things, and now I can't do them. And so it's a chance to understand who you really are, actually. So like with Alice and Still Alice, she had placed all of her worth and identity in being able to think and remember. And what happens when Alzheimer's takes that away? It's like, who are you and do you still matter? And so I'm sort of interested in, you know, we all wear masks and we all put on hats and we all go about our days and we think we are our biographies, like you said, all these beautiful things about me. And if I weren't that, if I chose not to be a novelist, like, am I still me?
Right.
It's like, well, yes. So I'm interested in sort of understanding our worthiness as human beings and,
Right.
and what are we here to do and who are we when all of that is stripped away. And and at the end, I think for all of my characters, it comes down to our connectedness and our ability to love and be loved.
That comes across so strongly in your work. I've also noticed that sometimes for your characters and the trauma or the ailment is both is terrible for them, and it's also a gift in a certain way. And it almost has a religious sensibility that this sort of that an affliction can be redemptive or reveal something positive. I'm wondering how you feel about that and how you navigate that terrain.
Yeah, it's tough because I never want to romanticize any of these conditions or diseases. I mean, this ALS is brutal. Alzheimer's is horrific. I mean, these diseases all have the obvious, the obvious tragedy, the heartache, the difficulty. That's there, and yet time and time again, you know, people don't. Actually, the people that I've been fortunate enough to know, and I have a self-selected group because they're raising their hands saying, "I'm willing to help you. I have ALS, and I have maybe 15 months left to live on this planet, but I'm going to spend some of my time with you." Like, wow. I mean, so if someone's willing to do that, that's probably a person who's been able to frame what's going on with them in a way that's somewhat positive.
Yeah.
Somehow. It's really heroic and inspiring. So despite and along with the heaviness and the darkness and the difficulty, you see amazing moments of beauty and connection and purpose and love. So I'm always looking for those pinholes of hope and what can be redemptive in all of this. Where are the gifts? I know a man who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's when he was 47, and he had twin daughters in high school who he never really saw because he was working 70 hours a week and traveling a lot, and you know, Alzheimer's is awful. And he lost his job because he could no longer do it. He was a vice president, and he said, "I got to know my daughters." He's like, there are gifts that come with this disease if you choose to open them. And so you want to say, yeah, but, you know, how do you write that without romanticizing, without minimizing? It's like sometimes it's a tough line to walk that truth,
Right.
but to be respectful of everyone's journey, because these journeys aren't easy at all. Yeah.
So let's talk about Every Note Played. Why did you get interested in ALS?
Richard Glatzer, who was the co-writer and co-director of the film Still Alice, was diagnosed with ALS 2 months before he read the book. And he and his husband Wash were faced with the decision, because they were offered, would you like to write the script and direct this? And they had to wrestle with, well, do we want, and he had bulbar ALS. It began in his head and neck, which tends to go a little faster. So it's, do we want to sell the house and travel the world? Do we want to circle the wagons and just spend time with family and friends? Do we want to curl up in the fetal position and cry? Or do we want to make one more film? And they had the grace and courage to say, let's make one more film. It'll be the last thing he ever does. And so I met Richard. We had dinner in Boston in September of 2013. And so I didn't know much about ALS. And in fact, my preconception was, we were meeting in the North End in Boston. For any of you who've ever been there, these tiny little like alleyways, and it's tough to navigate. And I'm thinking, well, they picked the restaurant, so there must be wheelchair access, but I don't know how we're going to get in here. And I thought that ALS began in the legs and progressed in paralysis. The paralysis moved up. Right. And it doesn't work that way. It can, but it can start in the hand, it can start in the head, it can go from one side to the other side. So I never heard the sound of Richard's voice. By the time I met him, he completely lost his ability to speak and was typing on an iPad. And by the time we got to set a few months later, his left arm was totally paralyzed, and he co-directed that film by typing with one finger on an iPad. And it's because he had no control of the muscles in his throat. The saliva would pool and drool, so he's wearing a bib and drooling and doing this. And you think about, like, this is the biggest film of his life. And like anything, like I'm tonight showing up, like I want to look nice. So I'm like, making sure I look good in front of all of you. And I want to like be my best self up here. Like to have the courage to show up looking like that and typing, I watched him very closely I got to be on set, which was really fun. And I was just in awe of his determination, his tenacity, his grace, his courage. And so I asked him shortly after we finished filming, if I could write about ALS next in his honor, and he said, sure. And we started communicating a bit about what it feels like for him. And at this point, he was typing with his big toe, because then he lost both arms. I know. So he died a couple weeks after Julianne Moore won the Oscar. But he was the first person I came to know with ALS. So this book began with Richard.
And how did your research progress from there? Like, what do you do to prepare to write such a novel?
Yeah, so for all of my books, I do my homework. So I read everything I can. So I read textbooks on ALS. You're welcome. You don't have to read those. So I do that. I read the scientific literature. I read the self-help, the memoir, all of that. And then I find the medical community and the scientific community. So I went out and I shadowed neurologists at the ALS clinic at Mass General Hospital in Boston. So I sat in with patients, got to know. So I need to meet the people who have it. Those are my real experts. So I met some of them through the Mass General Clinic. I went to ALS TDI, which is the only nonprofit biotech, I think, in existence, and they're solely focused on ALS. So I went there and met that team, and they hooked me up with people who have it. And then I met Ron Hoffman of Compassionate Care ALS, and he offers equipment and care to people who are at home trying to navigate this disease that can move very rapidly. And he was phenomenal. So he drives to people's homes. So I would and luckily he doesn't live too far from where I live, and so I get in his truck and off we go to people's living rooms and bedrooms and nursing homes. And so I came to know a dozen people with ALS, and 8 of them died before I finished the final draft. So there was a real sense of urgency while I was writing this book. I wrote this book faster than any book I've written yet, and I think it was in part because of the pace of the disease that I was witnessing in real time.
Was that the most surprising thing you learned about ALS, the speed of it?
One of them, yeah. I think it was certainly a new experience for me. So, like, while I've written about fatal neurodegenerative diseases before, like Alzheimer's and Huntington's, those tend to have, I gave Alice's disease a really fast pace at 2 years, and that can happen with Alzheimer's. But more often, it's longer. It's like 10 to 20. And so, for the people I know with Alzheimer's, we don't really spend our time focused on death and dying. We're talking about we're talking about living. What does living with Alzheimer's look like and sound like and feel like? And with ALS, the conversations were different. Like right from the beginning, we were talking about facing death and what is my death going to look like, and how am I going to wrap things up, and what do I want to do before I go, and the fears around that and the hopes around that. So it was that was new for me to really be involved in people's living right up into the moment. The day before people died, I was emailing with them.
So in the novel, you spend a lot of time not only on Richard, who's also named Richard, but not the Richard you mentioned before.
Yeah. Can I do a quick story on that one?
Yes, please.
I don't know what y'all believe. So this was fun. So I don't normally name any of my main characters after any of the people that I've come to know with the disease, because I just don't want anyone to think I've written about them. Like, none of my books are a portrait of a person I have known. But if I know you, I will probably sneak your name in somewhere. But so I don't do that. So I was hesitating beginning this book. I had a lot of resistance to actually starting, and I don't know. I was like, what is this about? Like, Lisa, you got to get to it. So there was one day where I was like, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna start the book today. But my biggest excuse for a while was like, well, I don't know the main character's name yet, so I can't start.
Right.
I know, writers will come up with all kinds of stuff to keep yourself from the page. So I'm driving home from dropping my daughter off from school. It was about a half-hour ride. And I'm like, all right, I need to start today, but I still don't know the main character's name. And interestingly, the name that kept popping up for me was Richard. And my excuse was, well, I can't name him Richard Glatzer. Like, I don't name after people I know with the disease. That's not happening. So I'm like, okay, I'm driving. All right, what's the main character's name? It was Richard. And I think I said aloud, I'm like, why can I not get away from the name Richard? And then what came to me wasn't the sound of his voice, but it was him. It was. He said, because I want you to, dummy. And I just burst into tears. And then I was like, I just started talking to Richard Glatzer. I'm like, I'm so sorry you're not here. And all I felt was his smile and his joy and his love. So I got home and I emailed his husband. I'm like, okay, Wash, well, I need to name the main character Richard because he just told me to. And I shared the story with him. And I said, but it's only if that's okay with you because I don't want you to freak out. And he said, no, it's totally okay. I said, oh, good, because I think he was going to keep pestering me until I did this. Yeah.
That's an excellent story.
Thanks.
So Richard is one of the main characters in a way.
Yes.
He's the concert pianist. But his wife, Karina, is also a big character in the book. She is his divorced wife, I guess, and they have all kinds of unresolved issues. Yeah. She becomes there's a lot of focus on her because being a caregiver for a person with ALS is a very big job. And so I'm curious to know why you chose to spend a lot of ink on her and how she became interesting to you.
Well, the book, I set the book up that it would be about these two people. So in learning about ALS, the obvious symptom is you become paralyzed, and so you become increasingly trapped in your own body. Mm-hmm. Most people, 75% of people, are totally lucid with ALS. Your thinking, your personality, your cognition is intact. Actually, for 25% of folks, you'll get frontotemporal lobe dementia on top of all of this. So it's like, can you even imagine? But so there's the paralysis, and then there's the other thing. The biggest fear is in line with the paralysis is once you can't speak anymore, the inability to communicate and reach the people you love. What if you're locked in? And today we have a lot of great augmentative communication devices. There are ways that with your eyes you can it'll track your gaze, your eye gaze, and you can land the cursor on the letters and spell out words. It's painstaking. So Like to finish a single sentence might take 10 minutes because it can also lose your gaze and you have to recalibrate. But it's possible that you're not entirely locked in anymore. But still, this is terrifying. And so, okay, that's the disease. And then if you think about, well, what's the story about? Well, I thought about a broken relationship, maybe a divorced couple where they're both still sort of trapped in sort of the blame and the excuses and the unresolved issues of that relationship, so that they're paralyzed in a different kind of way. I wanted to sort of explore that kind of paralysis alongside the ALS. And I think that a lot of us can relate to that, whether it's a relationship or a job or a life dream. Like, how many of us are stuck or paralyzed with fear or blame or excuses that we're not really doing the thing we want to do, or we're not saying the things we need to say. You know, I don't have ALS. I can say anything I want, but do I tell the people I need to that I'm sorry? Do I forgive when I need to forgive? Do I say I love you enough? So I wanted to wrestle with this couple that might have an opportunity to maybe. I'm looking for ways, like, so with ALS, I can't cure that disease in this book because this is not science fiction. This is telling the truth. I can't heal the disease, but can I heal some other things in the person? So yeah, and so why, and including her voice was important because, like you said, with ALS, this is a disease that affects everyone around that person. You can't have ALS by yourself. So I wanted to show the caregiver's point of view. And yeah, his ex-wife becomes his caregiver. I've been divorced twice. There's no way. Can't even imagine how this woman did that. God bless Karina.
When I was reading your this book, when there was a lot of noise, and there still is in the newspapers every day, about the Me Too movement and a new wave of feminism. And here was a woman who had, without giving too much away, her own career was somewhat limited by the career of her husband's, or maybe she's put some limitations on it. I'm not sure how you would phrase it. But it has a kind of heavy feminist component because she's rediscovering herself after suppressing some of her ambitions over a period of time. I'm wondering if you were thinking a bit about that in terms of those gender relationships, or how you thought about her career.
I think, I'm pretty sure I made those choices and wrote that before the Me Too movement, but I love the timeliness of that. I think just I have 3 children and a lot of friends who are in a similar life phase, and so I've seen, I was born in 1970, and so I'm in that generation of women who's like, yeah, you can have it all and be it all and do it all, but how do you do that? Right. So it's, for Karina, it was, she could blame Richard if she wanted to, and she's been sort of stuck in her life because it's easy to blame someone else. It's easy, like, well, someone has to be right and someone has to be wrong. And so she makes him wrong, and that makes her feel good to be right, but it's not getting her anywhere. So she made some choices in her life that she's not satisfied with. And so instead of doing something about it, she's dwelling in sort of being a victim about it. And through the course of this story, she finds a way to sort of see things a little differently. And I think a lot of things in life, in terms of our own sort of emotional paralysis, it's very much self-imposed. I mean, your thoughts create your reality. And so you can have a situation and think something about it, and that's how you're going to feel and live it. Or you can shift a little and think something else, and it's an entirely new set of possibilities.
It's possible that my favorite character in the book was actually Bill, who is Richard's
we love Bill.
caregiver, not related to him. And I loved how you humanized this. There are armies of people out there who spend their lives helping people through the most intimate moments of their days. And I'm wondering if that was a conscious decision to bring him forward as a character, how he arrived in your mind, where he came from.
All right, how did Bill get there? So, I did witness home health aides coming into the homes. There was this guy on Cape Cod. His name's Chris Engstrom, about my age, handsome, degree in art from Yale, loved to hike. I saw him every day with his hiking boots on, which broke my heart because he's completely paralyzed. But so every day, the same set of home health aides would come in and bathe him and dress him, and it's so intimate. And I asked, I got to know Chris pretty well, and we were emailing and visiting. He lived not far from me, and I asked if I could come and watch what happens. Like, how do you get dressed in the morning? And he let me do that. And he's like, all right, the title of the email, that one was The Full Monty. That was he wrote that. So this guy, Jean-Claude, was his Bill. And he'd sing these, Jamaican songs, and I asked, Chris, do you like the singing? He's like, do I have a choice? Like, that kind of led to that. So yeah, I wanted Richard to have, while he and Karina were going to have a lot of tension and maybe not a lot of tenderness in some of the caregiving at first, what can that look like, and how nourishing and healing can that be to have someone care for you? I mean, care is a big part of the book, right? When he goes to the ALS care clinic, and he says, what do they provide here that's care? They're just measuring all of my declining abilities.
Right.
He's looking for care. I think both characters are looking to be cared for. Yeah.
I was, ALS is suddenly in the news after Stephen Hawking died, and people have been publishing articles about where ALS research is and what led him to live for so long. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the state of ALS research at this time, and also his particular case, which I'm sure you've thought about.
Oh, yeah. I would love to talk about that, because there's a little bit of misunderstanding out there about Stephen Hawking. They think, like, well, did he not even have ALS? Because how could he have lived so long? So here's the deal with Stephen Hawking. So he was diagnosed at 21. They thought he'd have only a couple of years left, because it tends to go faster when you're that young. There is also the sense, there's sort of a double edge there. There's also the sense if you get really young, it can go slower and maybe plateau. So in some ways, his went really rapidly for a while. He would be dead. He would have died 33 years ago without the tracheostomy surgery and the tube that went on the ventilator that kept him alive 24/7.
Right.
So it turns out, eventually your diaphragm becomes paralyzed. That's what moves your lungs, and the abdominal muscles around your ribs. You can't get in enough oxygen. You can't expel enough carbon dioxide. You'll suffocate and die. So when you reach that point, your choice is you suffocate and die, and hopefully under the care of hospice or someone who can sedate you, and so you're not panicked, and it's not awful. It's a calm letting go. Or you have the surgery and you go on 24/7 ICU level care for the rest of your life. Because what people don't understand is it's not just like, oh, the machine breathes for you and you can just hang out all day. It's you keep producing saliva, so you will regularly form a mucus plug that will block the airway, and so someone has to suction that out, and they have to be aware of when that's happening, and that could be at 2 a.m. And then there's bed sores, and there's pneumonia, and there's all kinds of, and you still have to toilet this person and feeding tube, and it's constant care. And so Jane Wilde did that at first. That was Stephen Hawking's first wife. And then he went on, between the universities who supported him and the books that he's written that have made lots of money, he had money for round-the-clock full-time care. So about 93% of people do not choose to go on the vent. Between the expense of it costs between $200,000 and $400,000 a year. And just the quality of life. So I think Stephen Hawking, why did he live so long? A, he went on the vent. And B, I think he still had great purpose and meaning in living, even like totally, almost entirely locked in. Because he lived in the realm of his brilliant mind. He could do mathematical equations in his head. He could theorize as to the beginnings of the universe, and he found great meaning in
Right.
being here. So I think that keeps the person going. So most people don't do that. And so in terms of research, where are we at? So, a couple things. So in some ways, the ALS research we don't understand very much about ALS compared to something like Alzheimer's even. Certainly Huntington's. Huntington's disease is caused by a single genetic mutation. And we've discovered that, isolated that back in 1993. I mention that because every now and then, just this past week, you may have seen in the news, there's a new gene discovered associated with ALS. And some news outlets might even say the cure for ALS, is on the horizon because we've got the gene. And while I don't want to dampen anyone's hopes, it's like, well, we've known the gene for Huntington's since 1993, and we still don't have a treatment or cure. So what we're finding is a constellation of genes that are associated with ALS. And that's helpful to sort of tease out, like, well, what are the mechanisms? How is this happening? And there's a few theories out there. And the good news also is, if you 10 to 20 years ago, we had almost no tools to study what causes ALS. And the few that we had were really, really expensive to use. So only a few scientists in the world had the money to use them. Fast forward to now, we have a ton of tools to study this stuff. The technology has just, gone up exponentially, and they're cheap to use. So all the scientists in the world can use them.
Right.
So we're accelerating the advancements. So that's really hopeful. I mean, just think about the phone you have in your hand now compared to, did you even have a phone in 2000? So we've come a long way really fast. So the ideas behind it, I like the ideas around, so if your cells, if your motor neurons, so your muscles are all controlled by your motor neurons. Those neurons, they are in your head to your spinal cord, and your spinal cord to your muscles. And they control the impulse to move, like, I'm going to go pick up this glass, and then doing it. And then with ALS, the motor neurons die off, and then the muscles don't have any input anymore. So I can think, pick up the glass, but nothing happens because those connections are gone. And they think what's going on is whenever there's some stress in the body, whether there's not enough energy, so not enough glucose, not enough oxygen, if there's a virus on board, and so you're under attack by a virus, if there's heat shock, so fever, there's certain things in the body that happen that the cell's responses just stop. Like, don't make any more RNA, don't make any more protein. So your cells are constantly the machinery is constantly synthesizing new proteins. Proteins do all the work in all of your cells. So your cells aren't just sitting there all day long doing nothing. It's in constant response to what's happening in your cellular environment. And so if some crisis is going on in the body, it's like, shut off the machinery. It's like, stop the presses, stop the presses. So stop everything. Divert the energy to taking care of the crisis. Crisis goes away, and it's like, all right, start the presses back up. Start the machines going again. We think in ALS, the machines don't get going again for some reason. So there's a crisis somewhere along the line that hits, the machinery stops, and then it won't go back on. So a lot of the research is aimed at, why doesn't it go back on, and can we turn it back on? So they're starting to get a coherent idea as to why this might be happening. I think that's really hopeful.
I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll have the opportunity to take a few questions from the audience. There'll be a microphone, I think, in the middle here. So my last question is, what is your next book going to be about?
I just love that. I know, it's like, if you're not on Facebook and want to be there with me, come on, follow me on Facebook. Somebody the other day is like, I just finished the book, when's the next one? I'm like, give me a minute. So actually, I have two books in mind. I've been researching. I haven't started writing yet, but I'm about ready to begin a nonfiction book on memory.
Wow.
Yeah, I've been talking about Alzheimer's and memory for the last decade, and so, how do we remember, and why do we forget, and how does all that happen? How does stress impact memory? How does aging impact memory? When is it normal? When is it not? That tip of the tongue. Oh, what is his name? Why can't I remember the name? I'm 47. This is happening more and more. But why does that happen with names and not other things or titles? And so I want to write a book that gives some educational material on sort of our memory and forgetting, and then in between those little case vignettes of very interesting memory issues, like super autobiographical memories, people who were you can name any date in the history of this person's life, and they can tell you what they were wearing, who they were with, like everything. Korsakoff syndrome, which is a memory. You have memory deficits for any new memories. You can't into long term. So every conversation, if I have this with you, and we take a break, I'll meet you all over again, and I won't ever remember having had this conversation. We could have the same one again.
Right. Well, that'd be fine by me. It was really interesting.
Yeah, so it's fascinating. I know a woman with Korsakoff's now. We've been chatting for a while, and just sort of what that's like to relive every day from the point of having the disease on, as you know, you can't. It's as if it never happened.
Right.
Nothing gets added on.
What's your other book?
The other one is back to what I do, writing fiction. I want to write a novel about a woman with bipolar disorder.
Amazing.
Yeah, and everybody
Great.
makes that noise when I say that. So it's good. Okay, that's a needed story, I'm thinking.
Thank you so much for
Thank you.
answering all these questions.